Good evening and welcome to the Marin Interfaith Council's Getting to Know Your Neighbor's Faith, Ask Me Anything. We are with Lama Palden tonight from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, who is the founder of the Sukha City Foundation. And she will tell us about her Buddhist faith. But before she begins, let me make a few announcements. If you like what you here tonight and experience and like what we do with the Marin Interfaith Council, feel free to make a donation at marinifc.org. Scott may put the website address into the chat, so please feel free. This is one of our many Wednesdays where we have something happening. The first Wednesday of every month, we have Release into Peace with Annie. So short meditation on the first Wednesday of the month to kind of end your day. The second Wednesday of the month, we have our monthly meditation. And next month, we have Ashley Reed with us. Some of you may remember her when she worked with the Marin Interfaith Council a number of years ago. And the third Wednesday of the month, we do our Getting to Know Your Neighbor's Faith. And next month, we have the Reverend Vincent Pisuto, who is an Episcopal priest and practices contemplative Christianity and has a lot going on. So he will be speaking about that. After Lama Palden talks for a bit, we will have time for questions. And if you are with us online, then please put your question into the chat. I will try and remember to remind you of that when we start questions. So let me introduce Lama Palden. It's funny, I met Lama Palden many years ago, I guess 24 years ago, yeah. So in a very different place. So it's wonderful to come have her here and to hear about her practices, her faith practices, and get to know her a little bit. So Lama Palden is the founder and senior Lama of Sukha City Foundation, a Tibetan Buddhist center in the Shangpa and Kagyu lineages. With gratitude to her gurus, Lama Palden transmits, trains, and mentors students and clients, passing on the teachings and practices that enable one to reach complete awakening. She has a lifelong interest in comparative mysticism and inner spirituality. Lama Palden also worked for years as a licensed psychotherapist, and in addition to teaching, now does spiritual counseling at the intersection of spirituality and psychology. Her book, Love on Every Breath, is on the practice of Tonglen. And with that, I'll open it up to you to share about your faith with us.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Lynn. So speaking first just about the history and origin, I think everybody knows the Buddha was the first teacher in Buddhism, and he was born in India about 2,500 years ago and taught. He was very fortunate and he lived to be 84 years old. So he had a long teaching career because he attained awakening somewhere around 30, around that age. And not sure exactly, but somewhere around that age. So he had 50 years of teaching. So he was really able to work with his students and disciples very closely for many, many years. And following his passing, Buddhism eventually made its way into many other countries. And it came into Tibet mostly starting around the 7th century Common Era, and really rooted there very strongly and became very much the predominant tradition in all of Tibet was Buddhism. And up until the Chinese takeover, the people are still very committed to Buddhism, but the Chinese have not really let them practice in the way they did before, or worship in the way they did before. But still, Buddhist activity does go on in Tibet. And Tibetan Buddhism, or as it's technically termed, Vajrayana Buddhism, which means the diamond way or the adamantine way, spread not only to Tibet, but into parts of Nepal, into all of Sikkim, Bhutan, and In the early years, it went all the way down into Indonesia and other countries, but is no longer practiced there today. Today, Bhutan, Sikkim, of course, Tibet, where when they, as much as they can. And then in recent times, it's gone around the whole world. So when the Tibetans were fleeing, many of the top teachers and great masters fled Tibet in 1959 or around about that time when the Chinese invaded Tibet. So that turned out to be a boon for the world in that it disseminated the teachings far and wide and was really a wonderful thing for people like me in my 20s when I met many Tibetan great masters, many highly realized enlightened masters. And that was just a very wonderful time for me and for many others like me who, and I did most of my study in the Himalayas in Darjeeling, Sikkim, and Bhutan. Originally back in the late 70s and early 80s. And there's mainly three traditions of Buddhism, and there's what we call the Theravadan or Shravakayana, which is in Ceylon, Thailand, Burma, and other places, and then the Mahayana, which includes Tibetan Buddhism, but it includes Zen and Shan, which are mainly in China, Japan, Korea, North and South Korea, and somewhat in Southeast Asia. And then, as I said, Vajrayana Buddhism, which is also part of the Mahayana, but its own separate third tradition. So there's these three main traditions in Buddhism. All the basic principles are the same, and they have the same foundation for all of them. But then there's differences in the practices, there's differences. They all rely heavily on meditation, but there's some philosophical teachings that differ a little bit, and ways of practicing and that kinds of thing is somewhat different. So I'll talk just about Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana, but the basic principle of Vajrayana is cultivating wisdom and compassion, or wisdom and love. So the cultivation of these two is the basis for the entire tradition. And this is done through both study and through meditation, and extensive forms of meditation are practiced by, in the old days, yogis in caves, and that still happens to some extent, or in mountain huts or something, and in monasteries and nunneries. And then in the olden times, there weren't that many lay people who went deep into study and practice, but they were more completely full of devotion and had a kind of a simple faith, where, in the West, we've all become really deeply educated. So, as to the whole philosophy and all the many different subjects. And so most of the teachers that came to the West or taught Westerners all had a background of what would be kind of an equivalent to a doctorate in the West in terms of scholarship. And then also, like my teacher had, 25 years in retreat. So the great masters, 13 of those years were in a cave. And many of these great masters had many years in retreat or in caves or whatever. So, but this underlying principles of wisdom and compassion, and then there's many things obviously that come out of that, like what are called the paramitas, which are translated as the perfections, and that has to do with generosity, with ethics, with patience, loving kindness, with concentration and meditation, and then with wisdom. So the paramitas are also very important. There's many teachings, but they all basically fall under these two categories of either developing compassion or developing wisdom. And wisdom really not only means scholarly wisdom, but it really means the actualization of realization of the nature of reality and the nature of who we truly are. So discovering, coming into realization of who we truly are and what is the nature of reality. So in terms of holidays, the most famous holiday is Tibetan New Year, called Losar, and that's very widely celebrated. And then there's 4 other main holidays, which in the West aren't celebrated so much, but to some extent, depending on the particular center or tradition. But there's a festival in late February called the Festival of Miracles, and this celebrates when the Buddha displayed certain miracles, especially in this one city in India where he taught, named Shravasti. And then Sagadawa is probably the biggest celebration holiday outside of Losar, and that's when Buddha, commemorating his enlightenment and his parinirvana when he passed away. And that's in May, usually in May, sometimes June, but usually May on the full moon. And then there's Chukur Dechen, the festival of turning the wheel of Dharma. And when the Buddha first began to teach, it was in Sarnath in India, in northern India. And this festival commemorates that day. And then the last most important one is called Lama Duchen. And this is said that at a certain time, the Buddha went to one of the heavens and one of the heavenly realms to teach his mother. And when he returned back to earth after going to heaven to teach his mother, this festival commemorates that day. So these are the 4 main festivals, holy days and holidays. I think probably Lynn was saying to say a little bit about what possibly could be misconceptions about Tibetan Buddhism. And I think one of the biggest ones is about Buddhists in general, that they don't pray. And Tibetans are like the most prayingest people you could ever meet on the planet. When I was myself in 3-year retreat, we had like stacks of prayers we did every day, like huge stacks of prayers. So it's not true that Buddhists don't pray. And in terms of who do Buddhists pray to, really to the Buddha, but all the Buddhas, and to the Dharma itself, and to the what's called the Noble Sangha, that community of people who have awakened in the last 2,500 years through the Buddhist teachings. So definitely there's prayer as well as meditation. Some of the traditions like Zen, they pray very little, but other traditions like the Vajrayana, there's a lot of prayers. There's a lot of very colorful imagery in Vajrayana, and so there can be misconceptions about that. All of these images relate to a Buddha and there's various Buddhas. Shakyamuni Buddha was said to be the 4th. So the Buddha that all of Buddhism stems from is said to be the 4th that has come and fully awakened as a Buddha on this planet. So, but there's supposed to be more coming in the future, and there's other Buddhas that awakened, throughout the ages and in different world systems and etc. So there's many Buddhas, there's many what's called bodhisattvas. I should probably say something about bodhisattvas because this is incredibly important in all of Mahayana in Vajrayana Buddhism. So we take in our tradition what's called a refuge vow, which means you take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma itself, which are the teachings, and the noble Sangha. And then we also take what's called a Bodhisattva vow, and that is a vow to fully awaken in order to liberate all beings from suffering. And then how do we enact that, through actualizing the paramitas, the perfections I was talking about, through actualization of wisdom and compassion, and through really dedicating oneself and everything that one does in one's life and in practice and in study and whatever we're doing, dedicating that to the welfare of all beings. So everything is done in one's life for the benefit of all sentient beings. So this goes beyond one's own clan or tribe or family or nation, or even goes beyond the human realm to include animals and, beings from other realms, etc. So the Bodhisattva path and the Bodhisattva vow are incredibly important, and Dalai Lama has taught extensively on this, and all the great masters do. So, let's see. So yeah, all this colorful imagery is all different Buddhas in different forms. Like there's some that are fierce and some that are very peaceful. And then some people may have seen what are called the Yabyum images, the images of a male and female in union, sitting together. And that's actually a symbol of the union of wisdom and compassion. And in Tibetan Buddhism, the wisdom principle is considered the feminine part, and the compassion and love is considered the masculine aspect. And then they're seated in union, and it's symbolic of that. So I think that's a good introduction, and hopefully that's interesting for you all. And then we can have some questions now.
If you're joining us online, please type in any questions you have into the chat, and Scott will read them, and I will try and remember to say them after he reads them, because I know sometimes you might not be able to hear him. So thank you. Yeah, number of questions. One, the sense of being awakened. Who decides who's awake and who's not?
That's a good question, especially in the West, because nowadays a lot of people think they're awakened, but that doesn't really go by the Buddhist standards. So to really be fully awakened from the Buddhist standard of what really that means, it really means that what are called the kleshas in Sanskrit, so what we translate as the conflicting emotions, anger, jealousy, greed, pride, jealousy, and the fundamental basic ignorance that's at the heart of our suffering. These are all completely liberated, which means that really one has worked through those, and through the process of realizing who we truly are, and realizing our own Buddha nature, our own awakened nature, one has really been able to fully realize that and then actualize it. And that means, like, say anger, for example, comes up, one has to then directly work with that in terms of the energy and the presence of it, and how, what one does until those conflicting emotions are really fully liberated. And it's said that the energy of these difficult emotions or destructive emotions, the energy itself is a pure wisdom energy. So when those kleshas are liberated, it turns into a wisdom for that particular person, an actualization of these kind of this originally pure energy that gets distorted through our ignorance and then comes out in this way that is not helpful at all, then through recognizing the true nature of that emotion, it's actualized into wisdom. So this is one part of actually awakening, and not just like a one-time deal, like I worked with my anger and now that's it. You know, this is a lifelong process, really. And so, because it really means 24/7, one's able to rest in an awakened mind. And if energy or a thought of, say, jealousy or anger or whatever comes up, it's immediately liberated through recognizing that. What's fundamental to all of Buddhism is that the Buddha taught that our suffering arises from ignorance. And so out of ignorance then comes grasping or attachment, greed, and aversion. So both this kind of self-grasping, grasping things to oneself, and pushing things away. And hatred and destructiveness, violence, all comes under the aversion side of it, and greed and clinging and all of this comes under the, and attachment comes under the grasping side. So fundamentally, to be fully awakened, one has to penetrate through realization and the ignorance that's at the core, which is really the ignorance to who we truly are, and what the nature of reality actually is. And out of that, wisdom is actualized, and then this whole process of working with the aversion and the attachment, you know, and the liberation of that. So it's not something that means just like you had some realization experience and you're awakened. Mm-hmm. That's why I was saying, like, in modern times, some people go through a series of realizations and think they're awakened, but really having realization is only the beginning, because how do you actualize that 24/7 into your entire, personhood, really, and really actualize fully the qualities of wisdom and compassion.
So this may sound like a dumb question, but so are actualized individuals working in normal jobs, or, I mean, are they all over, or are they teachers, are they hermits, is it everything, is it?
Oh yeah, and you asked too, like, who decides? Usually I think someone's, there's 10 levels of the Bodhisattva path, and the 10th level or 11th level is a Buddha, fully awakened. And so, generally one's teacher and one's peers will know, how far realized somebody is and what Bodhisattva level they're on or whatever. But, and then what was the other part of your question?
Jobs, I mean,
oh yeah,
life.
So that could be anything. A lot of people do teach. Some people stay as hermits or in caves, or et cetera. My teacher actually wanted to stay in the cave, but his teacher, after 12 years, sent somebody to get him and said, you have to come back. And then he didn't come back. And the next year he sent somebody and said, either you're coming back now or don't bother ever coming back. So that was like, you have to come back. He would have stayed. I think many of them would have stayed as in hermitages for forever. The reason to come out of that is for the benefit of beings in order to teach. So at certain stages in one's realization or actualization, then people are asked to teach or whatever. And nowadays, our teachers, because we're in so many crises that humanity is facing, they've asked us to teach, more, like at lesser levels of realization or whatever, because it's just a time when it's valuable to have as many people as possible be able to access teachings if they'd like to, and actualize. And teachings, like I said, include both the philosophy and the meditation and all of that kind of thing. But then people could have any job, just depending on the person, whatever they like to do. You know, there's one woman, as an example, who there were kind of 4 main families in Tibet who were sort of at the top of all the lineages, the heads of all the lineages. And in one of these families, there was a daughter who was educated along with her brother, who's now head of one of the other lineages, the Sakya. And they sent her to Vancouver, British Columbia in the early 60s, after they fled Tibet. And she was a weaver. She actually was a very highly realized lady, and she would teach on the side, but her family had her marry because it was just, they felt it was safer for her and better for her to, after they were refugees, to be married. And then she had children, and then she was a weaver for all the years, and she continued to teach on the side and stuff. So sometimes people do that, you know, just depending on what people want and depending on what their teacher asks of them.
A follow-up to a question, something you said. You said that awakening to who we truly are and the nature of reality. Can you say a little bit more about those 2 things?
Yeah, that's a big subject. In Buddhism, and this goes through all the traditions too, but it's articulated a little bit differently in different traditions. There's a teaching about the 2 truths: absolute truth or ultimate truth, and relative truth. So relative truth has to do with everything we see and how it operates in the world, all cause and effect. So all of karma. So karma is basically cause and effect. Everything we do, every action has, you know, an effect. And so within relative truth, within everything that we see in the phenomenal world and how we experience ourselves, everything goes on cause and effect. So that's the truth of relative reality. But things seem to truly exist. From an absolute truth point of view, things don't exist the way they seem to exist to us. So now, you know, with quantum physics and stuff, there's some understanding of this scientifically. But what the Buddha taught was that things don't actually exist separately, and they don't individually permanently exist in a solid way. They just look like that. But like one example of this is like there's a chair, but if you take apart the whole chair, you're never going to find the chair. It's a construction, it's a concept. So chair is a concept. And even within each molecule of the chair, it isn't real. The material world doesn't actually truly exist in the way we think it does. It does in a relative way. So that's also called apparent reality. But from an ultimate point of view, it's all awareness, emptiness. So ultimate truth has to do with either clarity, luminosity, and emptiness, or awareness, emptiness. And everything is arising as, you know, as that actually from an ultimate point of view.
Well, another follow-up then was that if from an ultimate point of view, this physical world reality is relative and not what we think it to be, why not stay in the cave and just let the world fall apart?
Yeah. Do you want to?
That's our,
Why not let the world fall apart and just stay in the cave? And because it's said that as one has realization of true nature and really realizes emptiness or shunyata, the non-existence in actuality of phenomena, it appears, but it's not solidly existent in an independent type of way, and everything's actually interconnected. When one starts having realization, there's a tremendous amount of compassion that comes along with that, spontaneous compassion. And that's why people come out of hermitage, is out of this tremendous compassion for sentient beings. And that's why so many end up teaching. Now, you can stay in retreat and keep practicing on behalf of all sentient beings. You could still be, and some people, do that. They continue, but they just do everything like it's enacting and actualizing your compassion, through prayer, through meditation practice, and all of that.
Are there any questions online?
One question, could you expand on what you mean by beings from other realms?
The question was, could you expand on what you mean by beings from other realms?
Well, within a Buddhist worldview, the Buddha taught there were other realms, and that this is just one, like our solar system, our galaxy, our universe, that there's multiple galaxies and universes, etc. And that there are other places where beings, they might not be human beings, but there's some sort of sentient beings do exist. So, and people that have had a lot of realization since the Buddha's time have also sometimes, like the Tibetans, have talked about visiting other realms or just seeing them in their meditation, visiting in the physical body or in meditation or that kind of thing. So this whole idea that didn't come to the West for a really long time of universes and galaxies was already actually within the Buddhist teachings. So and it's I should say something about belief. Within Buddhism, there's nothing you have to believe. Like, if that's true or not, it doesn't really make any difference in one way, or another. So I may or may not believe that, but it doesn't really make a difference, and belief itself isn't really part of the tradition. It's more like, what do you come to know deeply in your own heart as true? And what do you really come to understand or realize as true? So when there's certain things now within legend and folklore, there's a lot of beliefs in some of these cultures, but from the great masters and everything, like there was they taught on a very sophisticated level. So it's not like about believing folkloric or legends or that kind of thing. There's a tremendous amount of legends within the Buddhist traditions, but it's not like necessary that you believe that, or nobody's trying to tell you that you should believe that. Does that make sense?
Are there more questions?
Can you tell us more about what your practice looks like, your practice in daily life?
Yeah, so most people in Tibetan Buddhism have a morning practice, sometimes a morning and evening, or if you're in retreat, many, then it would be 4 sessions a day where most of your time would be taken up in practice. And what practice would look like is, meditation practice, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kinds of meditation practice in Tibetan Buddhism of many different kinds. And then there's ceremonies too that involve meditation. So it might look on the outside like a ritual, but it's actually, there's specific meditations for each moment of that ritual that you're doing. And then there's also physical yogas. So doing physical yogas, doing certain kinds of breathing, special techniques and yogic breathing and this kind of thing. There's chanting, there's singing, a lot of mantra practice. So it's up to the individual between them and their teacher to decide what specific practice they're going to do, an individual would do in their own personal life. And then what I've done with Sukha City Foundation is, we train people in a whole basic fundamental levels of Dharma and the Bodhisattva path. And then I've also made programs where people can do the practices of 3-year retreat in daily life. So spending a couple hours a day in meditation in the morning, go through the practices that one would go in an intensive retreat. You go through a whole series, like a training program of different meditation practices. So it's quite individual within our tradition, although there are, so to speak, meditation curriculum that one can go through stages of development with. But really kind of where you land with all of that is with the student and teacher, and depends a lot just on what the student is really drawn to.
So it sounds very individual. Is there a communal aspect, with one individual and one teacher? Is there, you teach to groups, but is there a worship aspect that's communal as well? Or
Yeah, there is. These meditation ceremonies, we get together as a group and all do those together. And there's actually one that's quite similar to Holy Communion or Mass. In fact, a lot of Catholics, former Catholics, and a lot of former Jewish people come to Tibetan Buddhism because there's some similarities. It's interesting. So there are, and also we all meditate together in groups and do different kinds of meditation practices in groups, as well as these more ceremonial things that we do as a group. So getting together as community is very important, unless one is in a hermitage retreat. And in something like the 3-year retreat, then you do it in a group, and then morning and evening you do meditation ceremonies and meditation practices together. And during the day you do it in your own, like monastic cell, your own little your own room or your own little hut or something like that. But the community aspect is very important. And in Tibetan, in the Himalayan regions, they have huge monasteries. Some of them have thousands of people in them. And then the nunneries are usually smaller, but there's this huge tradition of monastic tradition, both for men and women. And in Tibet, like something like a quarter of the population was in monasteries. I'm not exactly sure that's right, but it was a huge amount of the population was in monasteries or nunneries. So that's obviously a whole communal situation.
are there more, or should I keep going?
There are more. Well, I think one you just answered, but if you want to say more about, was what do individuals do each day for their practice? Sounds like that's...
Oh, yeah. So I talked about a formal practice and having a formal practice at home by yourself, or maybe going to the center temple or something, once or twice a week or whatever. But then there's living it in daily life. So then there's, as I talked about, the paramitas, the perfection of patience, generosity, ethics, etc. Bringing this and bringing loving kindness, compassion, into our daily life. So it's really, and the ethical principles, living our life with integrity, with ethical principles, and how do we interact with other people, dedicating, even our worldly activities to the benefit of all beings. Some of the temples or centers have service projects. We've been getting involved with the last couple of years, and we're getting more and more involved with Buddhist prison ministry. And that now Buddhist teachings are going out, to prisons all over the United States. And so various service projects, you know, in the community and that kind of thing as well. And that actually, they did that in the Tibet and in the Himalayan regions, but that's actually been very influenced in modern times now from Christianity. You know, so there's a lot more of that going on now within Tibetan Buddhism as a direct impact from Christianity.
Yes, thank you. Wondering if you could say a little bit about prayers. What would potentially be in a prayer?
The question is for her to say a little bit more about prayers and what would be in a prayer.
So there's a very famous prayer called 7-branch prayer. There's different versions of it, but so this would be like paying homage to the Buddha and the Buddhas, and to all the awakened beings, confessing whatever one feels one's done that was not skillful, or that was unwholesome or destructive or anything like that. And repenting that, asking the Buddhas to continue to turn the wheel of Dharma, to continue to teach in our world system, praying for peace in the world, things like that, praying for the welfare of all sentient beings, praying that all sentient beings have their needs met and receive everything they need to have. So some are specifically about sentient beings and really wanting the best for them, and then some are more homage and supplications and stuff to the Buddhas.
That leads into actually a comment, and then you may want to explain what metta is. Someone said, I've been practicing metta. I really appreciate your perspectives on meditation, where consciousness is not always the ultimate value.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they mean by that. Metta is loving kindness practice. So this is, and metta is a word from Pali, which is from the Theravadan tradition. So they have a specific kind of loving kindness practice called metta that they practice. Metta is just sort of a shorthand name for it. And then we have certain kinds of loving kindness and compassion practices that we do in Tibetan Buddhism as well. So these are practices which really open our hearts and really open our love for all sentient beings, open our compassion for all sentient beings. And, you know, we learn to work through and hopefully come into a place where we love all beings in an equal way, not just the ones we like or the ones we're close to or the ones that are our family or our nation or something. But so the point of these loving kindness and compassion practices is to really open our hearts fully and to imbue our consciousness with loving kindness and compassion.
Since you practice Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama is from Tibet. What's his relation to the Buddha? I mean, as an outsider, what's his relation to the Buddhist faith? I mean, he was chosen as a child, right? But he has chosen not to choose a child. Isn't that what I heard?
No, he's recognized a lot of children
yes.
as various, what's called tulkus, as very reincarnate lamas. He has recognized quite a lot. He recognized one of them, the reincarnation of my own teacher, but he's recognized hundreds of children as reincarnate lamas. Yeah. So there's 4 main lineages and 8 kind of altogether, including some of the smaller lineages. And then there's other smaller ones too within Tibetan Buddhism, but he's in what's called the Galupa lineage. And he's not actually the head of that, somebody else is, but he's in some ways considered the head of all the lineages. You know, it's not really his actual like office or whatever, but it's just kind of an honorary situation, particularly because this particular Dalai Lama is very interfaith within Tibet and within all the traditions and lineages within Tibet. And just who he is as a person, as a practitioner, as a leader, has brought, so many people, all the Vajrayana people in general have respect for him and honor for him and everything. And then he meets with and is friends with and takes teachings with, like he took teachings from my teacher as well, with other great masters. They interrelate with each other and receive teachings and empowerments from each other. And so he's been a truly wonderful leader, not only for the Tibetan people, but for Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana in particular. And we take teachings, you don't just take teachings in your lineage necessarily. Like I've had many teachings from Dalai Lama and been with him a number of times, so, and I have with great masters from all the schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So it's not like they're philosophically different from each other.
Yeah, there's something to learn from all of them.
Yeah. And they have different flavors, but all the basic philosophy and teachings and everything is the same. That there's different particulars, different meditations that they have or whatever. And especially since coming out of Tibet, a lot of them have worked together quite extensively.
What does it mean to be a Lama, and how does one become one?
Lama basically means like a priest or a roshi, or like that kind of thing. And it's a title that's given from your teacher, usually, oftentimes given after one completes a 3-year retreat, which is like this whole intensive meditation and philosophy training. So like for me, I never wanted to be a Lama. I never wanted to be a teacher. The idea literally had never crossed my mind, but I really wanted to practice. So I went to 3-year retreat. And then a year or so after my retreat, my teacher made me a Lama, just bestowed that upon me. So it's like that.
And does one choose their teacher? Is there a teacher assigned, or how does that happen?
You choose your own teacher. Yeah, it's a very personal situation. And sometimes, you might study with somebody for a long time, but you're not necessarily taking them on as your guru, so to speak, as that kind of a teacher. And so there's different kinds of teachers too. There's teachers that just maybe instruct in certain teachings. There's, there's different levels. So like when I say my teacher, I'm really using it in the sense of guru. And Lama is a translation of guru also, but from the Sanskrit to the Tibetan. But I don't really act as a guru for my students. It's more like a regular teacher, because I'm not on the level of realization of the great masters, great gurus. So.
You mentioned Buddhas, plural, and some being afraid to acknowledge. Can you give us some examples of different Buddhas that are revered in Tibetan Buddhism? Yeah,
one is called Amitabha, and it is also greatly, hugely revered, not only in Tibet, but in China and Japan. Amita, I think they call him in Japan. And he's said to be the Buddha of like our world system or whatever. And so he particularly has to do with the, like we're in the desire realm. That's the realm that we live in, is called the desire realm, which means we're really attached to getting things. And so he embodies the complete transformation of that into wisdom. And there's those kind of Buddhas that were never really humans. And then there's people that are human that became Buddhas. like Shakyamuni Buddha, and yeah, so they call like Amitabha is considered what they call a Dhyani Buddha, which I'm not sure how to translate that. This is a Sanskrit word. But he wasn't like a person who became a Buddha.
Speaking of people, you've mentioned a couple of times reincarnation. Can you talk about in the Tibetan Buddhism, how does reincarnation work? What are the beliefs around that?
Yeah, the Buddha taught extensively on reincarnation, and that we create our karma in this lifetime, which propels into the future and into future lifetimes. And it also, of course, impacts this life. Whatever we do, basically, whatever causes we put in motion in our life are going to affect our life, and they're going to affect us in lifetimes to come. And so depending on our karma, then we're reborn as a person or an animal or some other kind of life form. And when I was a little girl, I used to remember past lives. So from 3 years old, not extensive detail, but I remembered I lived in certain different countries and different things like that. I never told my parents. I never talked to anybody about this. But so for me, that's one of those knowing kind of things, because I remembered it from so young that I had been in these other countries and other places. So again, that's something the Buddha taught about, but it's not something you have to believe. If you come into some understanding that you feel inside of yourself, it's true, but nevertheless, this whole idea of karma is very incredibly important in all of Buddhism. And, as you sow, so shall you reap, as the Bible says.
So is there one type of being that's greater than another? Or if you were reincarnated as an ant, is there a worse than, or
Well, yeah, it's said within Buddhism that there's certain other parts of our world system where it's really difficult if you're incarnated there. And as in terms of the human realm, certain, like our spiritual development and our other kinds of development carry through into future lives. And things impact us from the past, from past lives. They impact this life. And so say somehow a child turns up and they're just like an incredible musician from a young age. A Buddhist would look at that as they were probably a musician in their last life, and they really brought that to a lot of fruition. And so it carries along on the stream of consciousness. So there's not what's called a soul exactly in Buddhism, but there's like a stream of consciousness that's deathless. So it's in fact that we don't ever really truly die. We're deathless in who we truly are, but the karma is carried on the consciousness. And then when a teacher dies within the Tibetan tradition, the students of that teacher will often go to somebody like the Dalai Lama or the heads of the lineage, whoever recognizes these children, and ask them to recognize their teacher for them. And that's a reincarnate Lama. And so most people, are never really looked for, but the teachers are looked for, and, oftentimes, and then they're usually trained in the monasteries. So, of course, with modern times, this is undergoing some change, and we'll see how all of that plays out in the future.
How's it changing?
It's changing. Because nowadays there's just so much a child is exposed to in the world. Like they're also starting to train them not only in all the subjects they train them in Tibet, but train them in normal education, and then a lot of Westerners are feeling like what they did in Tibet was they took the children, usually boys, probably 95% or something, to the monastery to be trained somewhere between the age of 3 and 8 or whenever they're discovered. and trained them very extensively in the monastery, but they didn't, and they taught them to read and write and all those things, of course, but they like, you know, in the old days, they didn't have science and all of these different subjects. So nowadays they're teaching them more, you know, in that. And a lot of what I was going to say was that a lot of Westerners feel that it's not that good to take the young child away from the mother, that maybe a better system is to have the family come live by the monastery and train there, or train while they're still in the family. And there have been some of these incarnate lamas called tulkus that are born in the West and have stayed with their families and then been trained, or maybe go off for certain periods of time to be trained in a monastery or a nunnery or something.
Does someone eventually get off the cycle of reincarnation?
That's enlightenment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Getting completely off this cycle of reincarnation is when you're fully enlightened as a Buddha, you know. So, but then with the Bodhisattva vow, there's a vow to always come back. And this is partly to do with this incarnate Lama thing. These people all had Bodhisattva vows, which I talked about. And so because of the Bodhisattva vow, you would, even if you were highly realized and maybe you didn't need to come back, you would, in order to benefit beings. So that's a really, really strong principle.
Well, thank you for coming tonight and for sharing your faith with us. I've learned a lot, as I always do, so thank you. Next month, we have Reverend Vincent Pisuto from the Episcopal Church and a contemplative Christian. So thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you so much for sharing your faith with us, Lama Palden.
You're so welcome. My pleasure to be here, and thank you for all of you online for being with us here tonight.